Camille Okafor was driving her parents to their own business launch when her phone rang through the car's speakers, and the first 3 words out of the caller, "Are you almost?" were enough for her to recognize the voice before the display even finished loading the name. "Senator Walsh," she said, glancing at the dashboard clock. "Almost. Maybe 12 minutes out." "Good. I've been holding the podium introduction until you arrive. Figured you'd want to be in the room for it, given everything." "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to. I wanted to." A pause, warmth threading through the practiced cadence of a man who'd given 10,000 speeches and still somehow sounded like he meant everyone. "How's your mother's blood pressure holding up?" "Last I heard from Denise, launch week has her ready to fight somebody." Camille laughed despite herself. "She's fine. She's sitting right here, actually." "Well, tell her I said hello, and tell her the room's going to be very impressed tonight." She hung up a moment later, already anticipating the silence that had fallen over the back seat, thick enough that she could feel it pressing against the base of her skull before she even glanced in the rearview mirror. Her father, Emmanuel, hadn't moved. He was staring at the space where the phone had been, his hand still resting on the strap of the garment bag holding his good navy suit, his mouth slightly open around a question he hadn't yet assembled. Her mother, Denise, sat beside him, her face doing something complicated, recognition dawning in slow, uneven waves, the way water finds the low places in a floor it hasn't mapped yet. "That was Senator Walsh," her father said finally, each word placed carefully, like he was testing whether the sentence would hold weight. "It was."
"He called you."
"He did." He said. He was holding the introduction. Emmanuel's voice had gone thin, stretched over something Camille recognized as the particular vertigo of watching an entire evening's careful architecture shift beneath your feet in real time. "For you, Dad," Camille said, keeping her eyes on the road, keeping her voice level the way she'd learned to keep it level in 20 years of rooms far more consequential than this one. "We're 12 minutes out. Do you want to have this conversation now, or do you want to have it after the event, when we're not about to walk into 300 people? Her father didn't answer. In the rearview mirror, she watched her mother reach over and take his hand, the two of them sitting in a silence that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a story about their daughter that had just, without warning, come apart at every seam. The story of how Camille Okafor came to be the reason a sitting United States Senator was personally holding a podium introduction at her parents' small business launch had started 19 years earlier, in a cramped campaign office in Columbus, Ohio, 3 weeks before Camille's 23rd birthday, when she'd taken an unpaid internship nobody in her family thought was worth mentioning at dinner. Her parents had built their lives around a specific, hard-won definition of success. Emmanuel had immigrated from Lagos at 22 with almost nothing, worked 11 years in warehouse logistics before saving enough to open a small import business, and had spent every year since measuring his children's futures against the brutal arithmetic of his own early struggle. Denise, born in Cleveland to a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs to keep them housed, had built a career in accounting through sheer relentless discipline and had absorbed, somewhere along the way, an unshakable belief that the only paths worth respecting were the ones with visible, countable markers of progress: a title, a salary, a corner office, a business with your name on the door. Camille's older brother Tobias had gone into medicine, a cardiologist now with a practice in Atlanta, and had given their parents exactly the kind of legible success they knew how to be proud of. Camille had gone instead into political work, first as an unpaid field organizer, then a paid staffer, then over nearly 2 decades into the specific, largely invisible profession of senior campaign strategy and policy advising, the kind of career that never produced a business card anyone at a family gathering recognized, the kind of work that happened almost entirely behind closed doors, in strategy sessions and late-night calls and rooms where credit was, by design, rarely given by
name.
She remembered, with a clarity that still stung slightly 2 decades later, the Thanksgiving after she'd left a stable nonprofit job to join a long-shot congressional campaign that everyone in Ohio political circles had assumed would collapse by spring. Her father had asked, not unkindly but with genuine bewilderment, what exactly it was she did all day, and when she'd tried to explain, message strategy, Coalition building, the unglamorous grind of building a campaign's ground infrastructure from nothing. He nodded through most of it and then asked, gently, whether she had a backup plan. "You're smart, Camille," he'd said. "You could do something real with that. Something people can point to." She hadn't argued. She'd learned, by then, that arguing rarely changed the shape of what her parents believed was real work, and that the campaign she'd joined, a long-shot state senate race for a young community organizer named Marcus Walsh, a man nobody outside a handful of Columbus neighborhoods had heard of, was never going to register on her father's scale of legible accomplishment, no matter how it turned out. It turned out, over the following 19 years, to matter a great deal. Marcus Walsh had won that state senate seat by 412 votes, in no small part because of the ground game Camille had built from a folding table and a stack of borrowed laptops. He'd won a congressional seat 6 years later, with Camille as his senior strategist by then, and a U.S. Senate seat 8 years after that, a campaign Camille had run as campaign manager before stepping into a formal advisory role in his Senate office, not a chief of staff title, never anything with a name splashy enough to travel outside political circles, but a position of real, substantial trust. The person Senator Walsh called first on anything that mattered, the person whose judgment he trusted more than almost anyone else's in Washington, a relationship built over 19 years of unglamorous, invisible work that had never once translated into anything her parents could point to at a dinner party. She'd tried over the years, in scattered moments, to explain the actual shape of what she did, the policy briefings she wrote, the coalition negotiations she ran, the fact that she'd been in the room for decisions that had shaped actual federal legislation. Her parents had listened mostly, with a particular polite inattention people reserve for things they've already decided don't quite count, and had gone on, year after year, describing her career to relatives as something in politics, the same vague, faintly apologetic phrase, as though the imprecision of the description matched the imprecision of what they believed her actual contribution to be. What made it harder, and stranger, was that Camille had never corrected them with the one fact that would have ended the conversation instantly, that Senator Marcus Walsh, one of the most recognizable political figures in the country, considered Camille Okafor not just his most trusted advisor but, after 19 years, something closer to family, present at his own children's graduations, a regular guest at his wife Denise's. No relation to Camille's own mother, a coincidence that always amused them both. Annual 4th of July gathering, a woman he'd once introduced, at a small private dinner, as the person who's kept me honest since I was 31 years old and didn't know a single thing about actually governing. Camille had simply never found the sentence that would deliver that fact to her parents without it sounding like exactly the kind of showing off her mother had spent a lifetime warning her against. So she'd let the silence calcify, the way long silences do, one unremarkable choice at a time, until 19 years had passed and the truth had grown far too large to introduce casually over a holiday dinner. Her parents' business, Okafor Fine Imports, a boutique venture specializing in West African textiles and home goods that Emmanuel and Denise had spent 3 years building after Emmanuel's retirement from logistics, represented, for both of them, a kind of second-act dream, the chance to build something with their own name on it, something visibly, unmistakably theirs, after decades of working for other people's companies. Camille understood the dream better than her parents probably realized, understood exactly how much it meant to a man who'd arrived in this country with almost nothing to finally stand in a room and say, "I built this." The launch event had been 8 months in the planning, a curated evening at a downtown event space, invited press, local business leaders, a guest list her father had worked for months to assemble through every connection he could find. The centerpiece of that guest list, the name Emmanuel mentioned with a kind of reverent disbelief every time it came up over the preceding weeks, was Senator Marcus Walsh, who had agreed, through channels her father believed he'd cultivated himself, to attend and say a few words. "Senator Walsh is attending our launch event," Emmanuel had announced at dinner 3 weeks earlier, unable to keep the pride out of his voice, a pride Camille recognized as entirely genuine and entirely earned, even if the actual mechanics behind the senator's attendance were more complicated than her father understood. "This is how you build real connections, Camille. Years of relationship cultivation. This is what it looks like." Denise had glanced at Camille then, not unkindly, but with the specific note of comparison she'd been striking for 2 decades. You should see what actual networking looks like, sweetheart. Real effort. Real strategy. Camille had said nothing, the way she'd learned to say nothing in 100 conversations like this one, though the nothing had cost her something small and cumulative each time, a debt that had been quietly compounding for 19 years. She hadn't told her parents that Senator Walsh's attendance had, in fact, come through her, that Marcus had called her personally the week before, delighted and slightly bewildered, to say, "Camille, I got the strangest invitation to a business launch from a couple named Okafor. Any relation?" She hadn't told them that she'd confirmed, quietly, that yes, this was her parents' event, and that Marcus, without her asking him to, without her requesting any favor at all, had simply said, "Then I'm absolutely coming, and I'm going to make sure it's a good night for them." Because that was who Marcus Walsh was, underneath the title, a man who remembered always. That Camille had built her entire adult life around people who'd never quite managed to see the things she'd built. She hadn't warned her parents any of this because she'd genuinely believed, until the phone rang in the car, that she could let the evening happen quietly, that Marcus would give a gracious, generic senator's remarks, shake some hands, leave, and her parents would have their moment without it ever colliding with the 19 years Camille had spent invisible in their story of who she was. She'd underestimated, apparently, how much Marcus Walsh actually meant it when he said he wanted to make it a good night for them. The remaining 12 minutes of the drive passed in near total silence, her father staring out the window, her mother's hand still wrapped around his, both of them processing something too large to fit into casual conversation before they arrived. Camille kept her eyes on the road and let them have the silence, understanding, from years of watching people absorb difficult truths in campaign rooms and hospital hallways and everywhere in between, that some realizations needed space to settle before they could be spoken aloud. It was her mother who finally broke it, about 4 minutes out, her voice smaller than Camille had heard it in years. "How long have you known him? Personally, I mean. Not as a voter, not as somebody who follows the news." 19 years.
Since his first state Senate race.
I was his field organizer before either of us had any idea what we were building. 19 years, Denise repeated, and Camille watched in the mirror, her mother doing the same math Camille had watched 100 people do before, counting backward through years of family dinners, holiday gatherings, offhand comments about something in politics, trying to locate the exact shape of a life that had apparently been unfolding in full view the entire time, invisible only because nobody had ever asked the right question. "You never said anything," her father said quietly. "All these years. We had no idea. I tried a few times early on. It never really landed. You'd ask what I did, and I'd try to explain, and it always came back to whether I had a backup plan, whether this was real, whether I should be doing something people could point to." Camille kept her voice steady, not accusatory, the tone she'd used walking a nervous candidate through a difficult debate prep. After a while it just got easier not to keep offering something that never seemed to register. "I'm not saying that to blame you. I just want you to understand why you're finding out like this instead of years ago." Her father didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had a rawness to it Camille rarely heard from him. "I called your work not real, in front of your face, more than once. And you've been standing next to one of the most powerful men in the country for 2 decades and never once said a word. I didn't need you to think it was impressive, Dad. I think somewhere along the way I stopped believing that was even possible, so I stopped trying for it. I just needed." She paused, surprised by the sudden thickness in her own throat, a vulnerability she hadn't planned to let into this conversation. "I think I just needed you to ask a real question about my life at some point, instead of measuring it against Tobias's medical degree and finding it wanting. That's all it would have taken. One real question." The car went quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet this time. Not shock settling, but something closer to grief moving through the small space between them, 3 people confronting, in the same 12 minutes, entirely different versions of the same 19 years. The event space was already filling when they arrived, string lights strung across a converted warehouse floor, tables draped in the deep indigo and gold of the fabrics Okafor fine imports specialized in, a modest crowd of local press and business leaders and family friends gathering near a small stage where Senator Walsh stood, in conversation with two council members, looking entirely at ease in a room he had, until 9 days earlier, no personal stake in whatsoever. He found Camille within moments of her entering, crossing the room with the same unhurried warmth he brought to every space he occupied, and pulled her into a brief, genuine hug before turning to her parents with both hands extended. "Mr. and Mrs. Okafor, I've been looking forward to this all week." He shook Emmanuel's hand, then Denise's, with the particular focused attention that had made him, over 2 decades, one of the most naturally gifted retail politicians Camille had ever worked alongside. "I hope you know what an extraordinary daughter you raised. I've built the better part of my career on her judgment. I mean that literally. There isn't a major decision I've made in 19 years that didn't go through Camille first." Emmanuel's mouth opened and closed once before he found words. "We didn't. We had no idea the two of you were so close." 19 years, Marcus said, and something in his tone made clear he understood, without needing it explained to him, that this fact was landing on Emmanuel and Denise for the first time tonight, and that he intended to make the landing as generous as he could. "She ran my first campaign out of a folding table in a strip mall when nobody, including me, thought I had a real shot. She's the reason I've held on to whatever integrity I still have in this job. I don't take a meeting in Washington that Camille hasn't already thought through 3 moves ahead of me." Denise's eyes had gone bright, and Camille watched her mother press her lips together, fighting some complicated collision of pride and grief that Camille recognized because she was fighting a version of it herself. "I should get up there," Marcus said, glancing toward the small stage. "I promised your daughter I'd say something worth hearing, and I intend to keep that promise." He kept it. Standing at the podium a few minutes later, in front of a room of local press and business leaders who had, Camille suspected, expected a few generic congratulatory sentences from a senator doing a favor for a constituent, Marcus Walsh instead spoke for nearly 6 minutes about Okafor fine imports specifically, about immigrant entrepreneurship, about the particular courage of building something new after decades in someone else's company, about Emmanuel's story arriving in this country with nothing, and Denise's story of clawing her way up from genuine poverty through relentless discipline. It was clear, watching him, that he'd actually done his homework, had actually cared enough in the 9 days since learning of the connection to learn the real shape of her parents' story, rather than delivering something generic. And then, near the end, he'd paused and glanced toward where Camille stood near the back of the room and said something she hadn't expected and couldn't have stopped even if she'd wanted to. "I want to say one more thing, and I hope you'll forgive me for making this personal in front of your guests. Camille Okafor has been the single most important professional relationship of my career for 19 years. I've said this to rooms full of senators, and I'll say it here. In a room full of people who love her far more than any of them do, I would not be standing in front of you tonight, in this job, in this life, without her. I've told her that many times. I'm not sure I've ever told her parents, and I think that's a mistake I should have corrected a long time ago." The room applauded, warm and sustained, and Camille felt the specific, disorienting sensation of 19 years of careful invisibility dissolving in real time, in front of exactly the people she'd spent those years protecting from the full shape of what she'd built. She caught her father's eye across the room and watched him wipe, quickly, almost embarrassed at his own face. They didn't fully unpack it that night. The event demanded its own attention, guests to greet, press to speak with, her parents' genuine, hard-won triumph deserving its own uninterrupted evening, and Camille made a point of stepping back into the background where she'd always been most comfortable, letting Okafor fine imports have its moment without her own revelation swallowing the room entirely. But 3 days later, her mother called, alone this time, no Emmanuel on the line, her voice careful in a way Camille rarely heard from her. "I've been thinking about the car," Denise said. "About what you said. About needing one real question." "Mom, you don't have to. Let me finish, please." A pause, the sound of her mother gathering something difficult. "I grew up watching my own mother work herself to nothing for a life that never got any easier, no matter how hard she worked. I think I decided very young that the only kind of success worth trusting was the kind you could see and count: a title, a paycheck, a business with your name on the door, because anything less felt like it could disappear the moment you stopped proving yourself. Your work never gave me anything I knew how to count. So, I decided it must not be enough, instead of admitting I didn't understand it well enough to know. I know, Mom. I don't think knowing excuses it. I've had 19 years to ask you a real question, and I didn't, and I don't have a good enough reason why, except that I was afraid of finding out I'd misjudged my own daughter for 2 decades. Which is, I realize, exactly what I did anyway, just later and more painfully than if I'd asked sooner. Camille sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly, not fully, not all at once, but enough to register as real movement. Thank you for saying that. I'm proud of you. I should have found a way to say that a long time ago in a way you could actually feel, not just a way that sounded nice at Thanksgiving. The weeks that followed didn't resolve into anything as clean as full reconciliation. Her father, in particular, struggled visibly with the recalibration. Camille noticed him, in the months after, asking careful, halting questions about her work that she could tell he still didn't fully grasp the shape of, a kind of effort that felt, to her, less like understanding and more like a man determined to keep trying even without full comprehension, which she decided was its own kind of love, however imperfect. He'd also, she suspected, quietly wrestled with something harder to name, a grief of his own, for the version of fatherhood he might have practiced if he'd asked the right questions sooner, a grief he never fully articulated but that showed, sometimes, in the extra beat of silence before he changed the subject away from anything that touched too closely on the 19 years he'd spent measuring her against a scale that had never fit her at all. Camille kept doing the work that had defined her adult life, unglamorous and largely invisible even now, even after the launch event had briefly, unexpectedly, made a small part of it visible to the 2 people who mattered most. She kept her Tuesday night dinners with her closest friend from the early campaign years, Priyanka, now a strategist in her own right in Michigan, the 2 of them trading war stories and complaints over wine the way they had for nearly 2 decades. She kept mentoring young field organizers, the 23-year-olds who reminded her, uncomfortably and fondly, of herself at a folding table in a Columbus strip mall, believing in something nobody else had noticed yet. She kept running the trail behind her apartment most mornings, the one part of her routine that had nothing to do with anyone's evaluation of her, just her own breathing and the specific quiet of being fully, uncomplicatedly herself. Okafor Fine Imports, for its part, thrived in the months after the launch, not because of Senator Walsh's endorsement, though the visibility hadn't hurt, but because her parents had genuinely built something good, a fact Camille had always believed and was glad, finally, to watch the wider world recognize alongside her. She thought, some nights, about the particular quality of her father's face in the rearview mirror, the moment the phone call landed and 19 years of careful management cracked open in the space of 90 seconds. She didn't regret that it had happened the way it happened. She hadn't engineered it, hadn't wanted it exactly, but she found, in the weeks afterward, that she didn't fully grieve the loss of the silence either. What she grieved, instead, was something harder to name. All the ordinary years in between, the Thanksgivings and quiet dinners where a real question, asked at the right moment, might have given her parents a chance to know her fully a decade or more before a senator's phone call forced the issue in a moving car. She didn't know if her father would ever ask a question sharp enough to actually understand the shape of her work, or if her mother's old fear of uncountable success would ever fully loosen its grip. She suspected some of it wouldn't resolve completely, that she'd carry the memory of that 12-minute drive with her for a long time, not as a wound exactly, but as a permanent, quiet marker of the exact moment being fully seen by her parents finally became possible, 19 years later than she might have wished, and entirely by accident. That felt like something worth sitting with rather than resolving. She let it sit,